we're going into recording mode, and we'll see some of our colleagues joining in from around the world, hopefully. So it's been another challenging week. We had a guy, Akib was in Croatia. He was in Zagreb, and we had only came back on the just before the flights were stopped or the quarantine started for Croatia. So it's all pretty dynamic, this COVID situation. I think still certain countries are suffering the worst ravages, whilst here we're more worried about going back to school. Been talking to Australia, Keith. Yes. And Melbourne is still in lockdown. So yes. It's. I fear there's going to be a while to go because of modern day communications and people getting around the place. It's literally a vicious circle.
Yeah.
So in our village, nobody we know has had it at all. And my villagers are predominantly elderly, and so they've been very, very careful. My wife has been going around delivering food to people. She goes shopping and then delivers it in a box to their front door. And they will collect it with gloves, wash it all down, and so far it's worked. But it's interesting, the community spirit that's been created in the area. People are talking more to each other. They're helping each other more, and it takes a catastrophe for this to happen. It's such a shame why people can't always be so giving and generous in the ways they are. What do you do? I know you're closely connected with the church, Tony. What's happening in Rushden?
Well, it's the number of cases is quite low. I don't know of anybody that's actually had it that I'm aware of, but there are perhaps people that I do know have had a touch of it. But just down the road in places like Wellingborough and Kettering and Corby and Bedford, and they've had a lot more. But I think the bigger the town, the more dangerous it is, basically.
Yes. So, and what about you, Keith?
Well, I mean, Corby, Tony just mentioned Corby. I live in Corby, and there's only, one or two in particular areas that are recorded. Very little, really. Obviously, part of Northamptonshire, so Northampton has been, one of those at a high risk, principally because of one of the factories. But I don't know of anyone whatsoever that has been affected, which is so interesting.
No, I think you're saying the community spirit. I think I go a step beyond that. I'd say it's highlighted the true nature of many people. There are a lot of folk who've become more community spirited, partly because they have the opportunity, but I think it's also highlighted the minority who aren't community minded at all and are very self-centered. I think the sheep and the goats have been made more obvious.
Mm. Yes, sadly so. So we've got 2 minutes to go before we start today. Very important week, Keith, I think, because we're touching on a very important topic in terms of people.
I think the topic, the overall topic of, on our job function. And I think the danger is, of course, in our industry and with the effects of COVID globally, and, that dramatic reduction in flights, being able to go anywhere. And then we've seen a return in, the merging back towards what we hope to be normality. And then there are so many operators, that is airline operators, the pilots, air crew have been laid off, and because there isn't going to be the number of flights. But one of the elements that's associated with, of course, with the infrastructure and the airfield particularly, is that it doesn't matter whether there's one aircraft or whether there's 100 aircraft that is utilizing the runway and the taxiway network, then those facilities have to be serviceable and fully compliant. And that means that maintenance has to continue. So if we look at the maintenance element of airfield ground lighting, AGL, then therefore, there has been an opportunity, because of the lack of traffic density of the aircraft, for airports to do some key maintenance work, which they had planned. And of course, when you have high traffic density, you're unable to get access. So they've been able to do that work. But I do know of some people, even on the maintenance side, that are at risk of losing their jobs. And that's a potential danger to aviation safety.
Yes, and it is a particular concern, because I know that there have been a lot of restructuring, reorganisation, and people have lost their jobs in airports all over the world, and the consequences could be far-reaching. I hope not, but it's never ever been more important to make sure that the principles that we've been embodying in our series are taken on board, because and none more so than competence, because it's down to the people responsible for the airports, both in terms of management, regulation, design, and actually doing the job. It's incumbent upon them all to be competent to do and to perform the role that they're actually assigned. And so, without any further ado, I think it's appropriate that we get started now, Keith. If I'd like to hand over to you, it's our week 14. I'd never have believed we'd have been doing 14, let alone more of these webinars when we started out. But such has been the response, Keith. Delighted, thanks to your leadership in these and participation of Tony and our other contributors, that they've been so successful and so well supported. So thank you very much for all of that. I'm actually calling today from unfamiliar place. I'm actually on holiday this week, but I thought I'd just stop. No Tuesday would be complete without a webinar, would it, Keith? So I'd like to hand over to you now, and without any further ado, over to Keith now, and I'll join you again for the Q&A session in around about 30, 40 minutes. Okay, thank you very much, Keith. Over to you.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And, welcome to webinar 14, as Robert has introduced. This week, we're going to concentrate on the elements associated with competency. And so we want to be able to report to you the elements associated, the way the industry is moving in terms of how we train and how we gain that knowledge, but how we also assess that knowledge. So we need to get the knowledge and the skill and assess that. And so this is what this discussion is all about this week. And we will culminate with the Q&A session, but also we will be also asking for collaboration, international collaboration on this subject. So let me move on. So Robert, myself, and Tony Smith, the panel. Unfortunately, Paul Smith is unable to be with us, so we have some communication issues there, I think. So unfortunately, Paul is on holiday this week, but is unable to participate and just getting access. So let me move on and let me say, this is a presentation directly from ICAO, the International Civil Aviation, on their Uniting Aviation presentation. Competency-based training, competency-based training, CBT. What is meant by competency? Let us get that sorted first. Competency-based training, what is competency? It's a combination of skills, knowledge, and attitudes required to perform a task to the prescribed standard. This is the ICAO definition of competency, and it's referred to in the ICAO document, the PANS training document, ICAO document 9868. So when we go from competency-based training to then the assessment side, the document defines a systematic approach. It gives us what those competencies are and identifies training based upon competency. And that's something that we're going to talk about, because there is this change really in the thinking that we've gone through over the last 20 years with airfield ground lighting particularly, then a change of technologies. And it's been the training that has been available has been led by different independent groups. And so the performance standards have been somewhat irregular, we would say. So now the ICAO are looking and expecting that we have some regularity built in to into our training portfolio. And so this is what we're actually going to look at. Now this document 9868 in the part 5 will have a section on aerodrome personnel. And there was a discussion during May of this year. It was a virtual meeting, a webinar type of meeting, and participated by many people around the world. And here I've just put a few of the contributors, like the JATO, the Joint Aviation Authority of the Netherlands, the Singapore Aviation Academy, the authority in France, INAC, the Canadians, and the East African School of Aviation is a few of those that participated in this virtual meeting, all about competency-based training. And therefore, the definition came associated with what is competency and what are competencies and what is competency-based education, because that is where we're going to. So competency-based education is understanding the job, it's identifying what job we actually do. And I mean, from my perspective, many people have said, oh, you're an electrician, you work on the airfield key. Yeah. Oh yeah, you change the bulbs when they go wrong. I went, yes, but it's a little bit different to that, and we know that, don't we? And so we need to put this framework together. And so ICAO's meeting on the 19th of May was associated collectively across the aviation industry what we must be doing. And I have previously reported that during the last few years, and I'll say a few years because it's taken some time, there's been a safety oversight investigation by ICAO, and the result was announced during 2019. And in 2019, ICAO issued their Annex 19 and report, and they identified 8 critical elements associated with safety. And one of those elements, CE4, was a lack of qualified technical personnel. And what is interesting for us in AGL, we come under that umbrella, but we also come under the umbrella of CE5 and CE6. CE5 is the technical guidance on the tools and equipment that we should be using, and can we use them? Are they available, and can we use those that are available? And are they accurate? Are they repeatable, etc., etc.? And in CE6, was associated with the accreditation, the certification, the authorization. Are we authorized to work on the equipment that we have to look after? And so CE4, CE5 and CE6, AGL comes under that umbrella. But what I would like to bring to your attention is this, an extract from CE4, 4.1 and 4.2, the state. That means that it is incumbent on our individual nationalities, our regulatory civil aviation regulatory groups. The state shall establish, the state shall implement. Shall is mandatory. So this is coming out of ICAO. It is a legal requirement on each of our nations to ensure that we have qualified technical personnel. And qualified technical personnel means competent personnel. So how are we going to address that lack of qualified technical personnel? Well, first of all, we need to be looking at the directives, and then secondly, then we have to look at how we are going to establish exactly what an international portfolio of training and assessment is needed. And for airfield ground lighting, then we need to look at that. Now I'm going to, during this presentation, going to have some discussion about that very function of how we get international collaboration, so we get standardization across our industry. Excuse me. So in TMS Training Solutions, what we've done is we've taken that time, we've looked at the standards, we've also looked at how other technical personnel arrange their training, their assessments, and their overall certification. And by looking at those different technical areas, I mean, for example, we've looked at the aircraft. And when we looked at the aircraft have to be maintained. And so we looked at the aircraft and how they manage the maintenance engineers for aircraft. But those which are more closely associated with us is on the airfield side, the ground side, and it is the ATSEPs, the electronics personnel who look after the radars and the comms, etc. Now they have some clearly defined directives of how they train and how they assess and how they certify their ATSEP personnel for radars, comms, etc. So it was logical that when we look at the technologies in radars, the technologies in comms, etc., then when we look at the technology advances in AGL today, we don't just change the bulbs on the airfield when they go wrong. Then the technologies, we look at the constant current circuits, that's 99.9% of the world still are using constant current AGL electrical circuitry for the photometrics to get the light in the runway related lights and the taxiway related lights. And when we look at that technology and we look at the advances in that technology, the control, microprocessor control, we use PLCs in our control system and various communication mediums, to be able to communicate across from the control tower to the substations, for example. Then we look at the CCRs themselves, the constant current regulators, the power units for AGL, constant current power units. And we look at those, microprocessor control. When we look at the technology, we've migrated in nowadays from the suppliers from thyristor-based units into transistor-based units, into high-frequency-based units. So we're looking at this transistor-based units. Then we're talking about how do we get the difference of intensity levels. We use PWM, pulse width modulation. When we look at the lights themselves and the light functions themselves, we use lights for surface movement guidance. How do we get that? We'll be able to switch on and off, and the different intensities, different lights as individual light control and monitoring. So all those technologies together are most closely aligned to the radars and the comms people. So why not, when we look at the qualification of AGL technical personnel, we adopt and follow that their guidance? Quite logical for us to do that. Now, in line with ICAO is the IEC. Now, the IEC is the International Electrotechnical Commission, based in Switzerland. Now, both the ICAO has a dedicated working group associated with airfield ground lighting. So there is this ICAO Visual Aids Working Group. There's also a working group within the IEC for AGL, and that's Technical Committee 97, because the IEC, they provide the technical specifications for the equipment and the processes for working on AGL, whereby ICAO is a performance-based organization. They tell us what we must achieve, but not how to do it. The technical specifications is how we do it. So when we're looking at the IEC, they define the competency of AGL personnel in two ways. They give an objective, and here, look on this slide, the objective is that persons, and this is a direct extract, the objective is that persons who have responsibility for any activity or are directly engaged in the maintenance of AGL's constant current series circuit, that is 99.9% of the world, are competent to discharge those duties or perform those tasks. And then the second part is the requirement. And the requirement by the IEC is that all persons who have any responsibility for any activity, including management and maintenance, shall have the appropriate and verifiable training, technical knowledge, experience, and qualifications relative to the specific duties they have to perform. So are you a designer? Are you a supplier? Are you an installer? Are you a commissioning engineer? Are you a maintainer? Or are you an operator? You're from an air traffic control viewpoint. So depending upon your role, then we have to have the appropriate qualifications, training, technical knowledge, etc. So this is the competency as defined by the IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission. And when we look at the two specific technical specifications that are relevant to competency and which define competency is the IEC 61821 and the IEC 62143 technical specifications. 61821 is the electrical installations for the lighting and the beaconing of aerodromes, and it's for the maintenance of AGL constant current series circuits. That defines the competency. In 62143, the electrical installations again for the beaconing of lighting and beaconing, that gives us the guidelines for the development of a safety life cycle methodology. Why should we need that? Why? Because the AGL system, the constant current system, has voltages in excess of 1000 volts in many circuits. And in our national regulations, each of our national regulations, that is in our electrical regulations, any electrical system or circuit that has voltages of 1000 volts or above shall have safe working procedures or adopt high voltage safe working procedures. It is the law in your country. So therefore, IEC 61821 and 62143 reminds us of that. Now, I come from the UK. I'm based in the UK. So in the UK, then we have our national standard. We have our electrical regulations, and we have our British standards. When we look at our British standards, or for example, those of you who are based in Europe, the European norms, the European standards, then the IEC 61821, in my case, is a BS, British Standard IEC 61821. If you're in Europe, it is an EN, European Norm, IEC 61821. So it is the law. It's the law. And what it does, what these documents actually refer to, is it says that we must demonstrate to the relevant bodies that the requirements have been met, of the objectives have been met. So the requirements, IEC, I mentioned, is requirements and objectives. I've told you what the requirements are, I told you what the objectives are. So the relevant bodies, the example is an aerodrome management, so the aerodrome itself, the airport, any certification licensing bodies, the safety regulators. Now that's an interesting. Do your civil aviation regulators check the competency of the personnel? Or do they just look at the equipment that you have installed and how it is physically maintained to keep it compliant? But what about the people? The other is the notified body, there's international directives and the national standards bodies. And this is where national standards bodies, where I just mentioned BS, so I come to the UK, British standards. Now in your national standards bodies, there are your electrical regulations, voltages in excess of 1000 volts. So let's have a look. Who could say, when we start to look at competency and then assessment, how could we get a certificate to say we're competent? Well, the directives come from both ICAO and the IEC say that a license, it could be in your certificate to say you're competent, could be a license delivered from the authority itself, the Civil Aviation Authority itself, or it could be from an air navigation service provider. It could be from the airport, or it could be from a training, an appropriate training organisation or academy, or it could even be via an accredited educational institution, that a college or a university, if they had an airfield ground lighting course. Remember, airfield ground lighting course and the definition of competency, the knowledge and the skill. So it's both theoretical and on-the-job training, they go together. And the certificates of competency are also only valid for a predetermined period. And that's an interesting, because how long is it since you had training? I've been on airports and the guy said, "Oh, you can't tell me, Keith, I've been here for 20 years. So that's very good, very experienced. When did you last do a training course? 15 years, or something like that. Okay. And clearly, then technology has changed. Process has changed in that period of time. So when we come to accreditation, and I brought up two slides here, you see the left-hand slide and the right-hand slide there. This is a slide directly taken from the IEC. And it's very clear, the IEC are very clear when it comes to competency. The IEC defined competency, and we know the ICAO defined competency. But how to accredit a person who has had the suitable training and has gained the skills, how do we accredit them? Accreditation is national. So in your country, it's your authority, or your airport have an accreditation scheme for airfield ground lighting. That's an interesting question. Of course, some do. Last week, we looked at Muscat International Airport, and by their kind agreement. We gave a presentation from Muscat International Airport, and they have looked at this, and they, with their Learning and Development Centre, then have defined that what training is needed, and then they then have approved that training, and therefore they will issue a certificate associated with competency levels. Not all nationalities, not all airports do this, and so many will look at others. They'll look at the suppliers, for example. We go to a supplier. Do you have a training course? The supplier's training is based upon their equipment. It's not generic. Therefore, it's an very, very complex scenario. So we need to come together to get an international collaboration on this subject. Also, what's interesting, that in the IEC, they also refer to conformity assessment. Well, actually, conformity assessment with the training is competency-based training and assessment. That is where we need to really start to look at it. So let's have a look at it in a little more detail, and how we can actually package all this information to bring it to reality. Well, let's go back to the core competencies associated with what is needed in AGL. Well, yes, we've got the equipment that's installed in the field. We've got to have tools and equipment that we're going to install it and commission it and maintain it. If you're going to maintain it, you've got to have spares, because things will go wrong. We need to have processes and documentation. We've got documentation for the equipment because they've got the technical specifications internationally from the IEC, or if you're in the US, under the US thing, from the FAA. So the technical specifications, the FAA call them advisory circulars, the IEC call them technical specifications. And we have these procedures, and one of the procedures is safe working, for example. Then we come to the people. A statement on competency only. What is the competency? We need to have electrical knowledge and skill, power, distribution, controls engineering knowledge. We have to have mechanical knowledge. Why do we need mechanical knowledge for electricians? We need to have mechanical knowledge because we have to fix the equipment in the field. And if it's an inset line, then we have to bolt or secure an inset light into a base unit that has been glued into the pavement. So we need to have some civil engineering understanding. I don't have to be a civil engineer in great depth, but we have to have that part of it and that understanding on both mechanical and civil engineering. And also, it's a light unit. A light unit gives light. So we need to have some photometry understanding of what light is about. We have to point the light in the correct direction. It has a beam spread, vertical and horizontal. So we have to have that real understanding. So when we look at the life cycle of our job function, then we can start to do an analysis on what training is needed. And when the training, how are we going to assess? So I'll move on to this next slide. Now, this was given by me. This is a slide out of one of my presentations. And look at the date, 2009. 2009. 11 years ago in December, I gave a presentation on this very subject, and we're still waiting for regulatory directives. Trained and competent staff or untrained alternatives. So we need to achieve competency and proficiency. The timing, we can't wait any longer. I mean, you think training is expensive? You try an accident. And remembering the philosophy, no dumb question. You mentioned this last week. in a presentation from Muscat International Airport under the Oman Airports umbrella. There are no dumb questions in aviation. And whatever decision you're going to make out in the field, on AGL, make sure you'll have to explain it to the foreigner. Of course, safety is non-negotiable. In the event of an incident or accident, you'll be asked to explain yourself. So we look at serviceability and we look at unserviceability. Split it into two ways. Serviceability is compliancy. Unserviceability is non-compliance. It's as simple and straightforward as that. What we want to do in the operational maintenance phase is to do preventive maintenance before something becomes unserviceable. That's the idea. And this was taken directly from last week's. And I have to say, thank you very much to Oman Airports for their participation and approval for us to have last week's webinar. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Now let's have a look at how we're going in terms of training and how we're packaging training and competency assessment. What we're doing is we've looked at, as I said earlier, we've looked at the other areas in aviation, the engineering areas of aviation, and said, how are they doing it? So we followed basically the process. There is a phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. The phase 1 is basic training. So after we have been selected to be an AGL person to work on the airfield, then we have to do some basic training, initial training. Then, depending on our job functions, now if you're a designer, you might be, say, an installer or a commissioning engineer or a maintainer, etc. Then we do qualification training, and there are different modules depending on our job function. And thereafter, we can assess. So right in between phase 1 and phase 2, and then onwards towards phase 3, is competency assessment. Thereafter, when we're looking at time scale or there are equipment changes, we have to do continuation training. And even then thereafter, we have a phase 4 called development training. That's if you say you are the electrician and then suddenly the shift supervisor decides to find another job, and we've got to appoint another supervisor for the shift. Then in a maintenance team, then you may apply. If you apply, then that is part of career progression. So the development phase is associated with additional trainings associated with career development, for example. And so that is what we do. So as we look at each phase, we follow step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4 for each of these phases. And that is what we have done. That has been completed. Now, let's have a look at this. Now, look at this here, this timeline at the top. Going back, pre-2000, over 20 years ago, it was just the user. What training do we need? Then it was product-based training as we get into the early 2000s. Then some 5 years or so later, it became a supplier-based. So the supplier said, there's a little niche here. We train people to use our equipment, in great depth, and they will always come back to us. And so it was supplier-based. Then we moved on to looking when the computer technology was introduced. Then it was computer-based. We can use computers. We can do all kinds of online stuff and things like that and learn. But then there was a gap. And this is where the proficiency, the competence and the proficiency started to emerge. But we are now going into what we know. We are service related, aren't we? So what we do, we use the ADIC principle to have a look at our competency-based training and assessment. And in the training needs analysis phase, we look at this whole element of what do we need according to the ADI principles. So have a look at these slides afterwards in great detail. Then we're going to deliver training. How are we going to live it? Is it instructor-led? Is it online? Is it on the job? So there we have analysed the need and put together the training delivery function in this phase here. But then to whom? To whom? So this is where the service function comes in, associated with service-based training. Who, what is our job? Are you a consultant, designer, a civil engineer? Are you really a commercial person, or a sales, or a project manager, or even the third-party contractors, etc.? Or are you the installation contractor, the commissioning engineer, or are you the maintainer in the operations department, etc.? But in the middle of all this, of course, is the regulator looking at all these elements. So when it comes to the assessment, the competency process, then we'll look at the training phases. So let's have a look at the training phases in a little bit more depth, and have a look at these later. You know, I'm talking about them now. If you've got any questions, but if you look at the presentation, it'll be on our line on the website later. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. Basic training is in two parts. Part 1 is associated with, and I've taken the maintenance function as an example. There's a design, there's a installation, there's a commissioning engineers, there's the maintenance engineers, etc. I'm taking maintenance as the example. So taking the maintenance, we do part 1 and part 2. Airside induction, got to learn to drive, you got to know how to use a radio and all the safety features of going airside. So that's one part of that, of part 1 training, basic training. And then you've got to understand what the standards are, the principles are, and airfield layout, you know, runway, what's there, why it's there, etc. The taxiway network and the apron. So we need to know all those. So that comes into part 1. When in part 2, it becomes how is the application? What are the compliance needs of the different AGL systems? What are the compliance needs of an approach slide? What's the compliance needs of our PAPI? What's the compliance need of follow the greens on the taxiway network, for example? When it comes then, we go to the next stage, qualification training. What is our job function? Are we the electrician out in the field, or are we the designer? Different job functions. So we have to have different understanding. But all of us need to have the theory, we need to have understanding of the practical, and we need to be site specific if we're a maintainer or an installation. The continuation training is, as I explained a little earlier, is when there is refresher training. And one of the things that we had to look at is how often do you do refresher training? And so we have come up with a suggestion in terms of that. And then the career development side, if you're moving from one job function to another, you know, from being an electrician to the supervisor to be the departmental manager, whatever, it is development training. So it's a very, very very, very important that we can see that these clear phases are defined for airfield ground lighting. To date, they have not been. So we are taking really the lead in this. And so when it comes to the AGL person, the practitioner, whoever you are, designer, installation, you know, commissioning, maintainer, etc., then I already mentioned about how a certificate of competence can be issued. And so what we did, as I mentioned, is we looked at the ACEPs, the electronics personnel, and we looked at their process. So we have adopted that process. And so on the next slide, what I'm going to do here is show exactly how we would follow the process to competency certification, accreditation, and for the different phases. Well, pretty clear, you've got to be selected first. Now, if you're going to be selected, it's mandatory that you've got to have an electrical or electronic engineering qualification of some description. The interesting part is, if you've got an electrical qualification, you've been trained on constant voltage systems, not constant current systems. Hence, the introductory stage to have an understanding from constant voltage systems, that is building technology, etc., to airfield technology, lighting technology for constant current. But it would be an advantage also if you have got an aviation related background and have some understanding. So that's the selection process. But once you've been selected, then we go through basic training. And here you will see here the basic training phases, 1, 2, which I mentioned earlier, then onwards to qualification training. Now the qualification training, depending on what your job function is, then you move on. Once you've done the basic training and the qualification training, you can be assessed. If you fail, for whatever reason, fail the skill side, then you come back and have to do the qualification training again. If you lack knowledge, maybe maybe the knowledge is associated with what you've missed on the first phase of basic training, or it's the second phase. So the loop is there. So there is the loop that we can go back. So just because we fail doesn't mean we're thrown out. We can actually go through this loop. But once we've been recognized and approved, and it's about recognition, and then remember, this is a national thing. It's not an international, it's a national thing. Then once we've been recognized, then continuation training will continue during your life expectancy associated with working on AGL. And we are suggesting that continuation training is given after 3 years, or when there is technology changes. The other part is the development. Are you going to then move from one job function as an electrician to being a supervisor, to be a manager, etc.? Then there is the development training. And it's that part where we've put this together. So this is how TMS Training Solutions will be offering trainings worldwide under this structure. So we can justify our training because we've done a training needs analysis. We can demonstrate, you can gain the knowledge, the skill, and we can assess against that according to your job function. So this is a call. This is a call for collaborative international participation. We believe we cannot carry on without going down this route. So we need to gain the knowledge, we need to have the skill, and we clearly have to have the attitude, and that will lead us to safety, compliance, and competency. And so we ask for your support. We ask for your international collaboration. So please contact us. We welcome your coming to us, and there is the details here. Look, our training manager, Felicity Parks, and she's based in the UK, and these are her contact details. So please, we want to standardize training and competency certification internationally. We want to coordinate with all the relevant bodies, all the civil aviation bodies, the ICAO and the IEC. So we need to, you need to help us to lobby your national authorities so that you can gain the advantage of getting accreditation. And I think that really brings it. Now, I think we can go now, guys, on to our question and answer phase. So what I'll do is, I don't think it's appropriate probably to stop sharing there. And can
okay,
we...
Keith? Yeah.
Yeah, come online, Robert. Are you Robert and Tony?
Well, thank you, Keith. I think this week is extremely important to put everything into context, because we've talked about the processes, we've talked about compliance, the standards, we've talked about the environment, we've talked about equipment, but ultimately it's about people and competent people. And we're, as Keith's explained, we're in a fast-changing environment, and that requirement requires us to change, because as we're moving towards collaborative decision making, as we're unfortunately finding ourselves in very difficult circumstances with COVID, having to do more with less resources, it's the responsibilities are greater than ever on our shoulders to deliver safe, compliant airfields. And that, of course, requires us to be at the top of our game, to be the most competent people we can be. And I thank you, Keith, for explaining and laying out the framework, how that might be achieved, very much in keeping along the lines with the ICAO 19, Annex 19. So now in that context, we have some questions coming in already from our audience there, and the first one fits in very neatly with this. So Tony, we've been asked, why don't we make some papers according to IEC requirements for ICAO and the Visual Aids Working Group to put AGL license in Annex 1? Now, Tony, you've been doing some work with us following an earlier webinar to do something very similar, haven't you?
Yeah, it seems to me that ICAO has made some recent moves to do something about this whole area of competence, properly trained people and so on, and that's the way to go. And particularly what Keith said, I pick up on. He said in the 99.9% is constant current circuits, which is unusual. That particular architectural structure of your power distribution and so on, of course, is the standard now. But if you have this competency built in ICAO, IEC, and so on from now onwards, much more firmly, the technological changes are coming, like the considerable changes that really would come in if LED lighting is powered in the optimum and controlled in the optimum way for LED lighting, not as a lookalike to tungsten halogen lighting. That will bring new challenges and new competencies, new training required. So I'm sure Keith would want to say, and I'm putting words into his mouth, it's important that we do this internationally, because Annex 14 is so wedded to the past in many ways. The competency things can drive those other annexes forward into the future, which is going to be necessary if things are going to be safe and efficient.
Yes, I'll come in again there, Tony. 100%, behind you in this, as you know very well, and the call for international collaboration is pretty fundamental. But of course, if we are talking to what we wish to propose and talk directly to ICAO, then it has to go via the national authority. So everybody needs to lobby their national authority, your civil aviation authority, because it needs to be through that route for ICAO. If we look at the IEC, then it had to go through your national standards bodies. And here in the UK, we would have to do it through the British standards, the British standards route, because that is the route that we go to these two main international bodies. And we are proposing to bring together an international collaboration to do that.
Yes, thank you, Keith. Yeah, I think you make a good point. It is very helpful to the industry as a whole and all practitioners if you as individuals in your own nation states can make representations to your representatives on the Visual Aids Working Group and the other panels, IEC and the like. So I have some questions here about not being able to access webinar videos. Felicity, if you can check after this broadcast, make sure that all of the webinars, including those after number 10, are made available. We will check that, and you will be able to access them because they're all recorded, and they should all be available on the tmstrainingsolutions.com website. The next question I have talks about competence. Competence is a requirement. I'm responsible for airfield lighting at my airport. In view of, in lieu of any national standard for competence, what should I do? So there we have an airport without any clear standards for competence in their nation state. How should they address that, Keith?
Well, I think my presentation overall, as it gives that, it's incumbent on all nations to follow the guidance from ICAO, and we all sign up. All our nations sign up to the protocol of ICAO. Now, some nations are more active than others. But in the absence of a national directive, then you have to have an appreciation that an airport needs to gain a license. And an airport gains a license via its own national regulatory authority, who is the representative of ICAO. And the airlines, when they decide to be able to fly into that airport, will want to see that evidence. Because otherwise, then they would have a liability element if they from their insurers if they are landing on an unlicensed aerodrome, and therefore, to answer that question directly, in the absence of national directives, then you refer to the ICAO and the IEC directives.
Right. Thank you.
Just a thought that occurs to me. If you happen to be in a state where, if you like, the state aren't really giving you much help in establishing the requisite standards and so on, it seems to me on the one hand you've got ICAO and IEC documents and the sort of courses that Keith is proposing and offering. If you followed that route, then at least you would be in a position to say, well, there is a structure there that is behind the decisions I've taken as to what to do at this airport. It would give you, I feel, a much stronger background if anyone comes asking awkward questions to say, well, I've been trained in compliance with the ICAO requirements, and on that basis I took these decisions. Rather than at the moment, I get the feeling that in some places you really are on your own with nobody telling you what you need to do, but I've got a big stick who'll come and beat you and say you've got it wrong if anything happens that is either dangerous or there are serious accidents. Now, you're not in a very strong position to be able to say, well, I did what was required of me to the best of my ability. You're left rather open to a one-sided argument when something goes wrong.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Tony. I think, in currently faced where competence is a requirement, yet competence is not well defined in terms of how to evidence it. I think it falls upon, and I've seen this in a number of the more proactive airports around the world, where they have, for example, as in Muscat, in Oman, they have they've set up their own learning and development functions. They have structured training plans. They identify the development needs of their staff, of their personnel, and they take steps to ensure that they have the necessary training, education, and and they record that such that they, heavens above, it could be required, but they could actually demonstrate that their staff are, to all intents and purposes, competent and qualified to do the job they're doing. This also goes.
Correct. You're quite correct, Robbie, in what you're saying. You know, Muscat is, and yes, thank you very much to Oman Airports. I say again, and they've done that because of their own needs, their own national needs, and in the absence of any international directives to help them towards that, they have come up with that structure, which is basically following the guidelines which I've discussed today. And there are other airports around the world, and from my own personal experience, going to such as Singapore, going to South Africa, you know, the airport authorities, and it's the airport authorities rather than the aviation authorities that have taken that decision. And in Muscat, it's the airport authority, eh? So it's Muscat airports that have taken that, and that is actually in some ways quite sad that it's been left to the airports authorities or individual airports to decide for themselves without some clear directives from the regulatory authorities.
Yes, it's a very specialised niche area, and one of the challenges has always been that the lack of expertise and the doesn't make it a particularly attractive area for external trainers to train in, but which fits in with the question, another question I have here, that you mentioned in previous weeks you would be doing instructor-led training, some online training, Keith. Can you give more details about what form this training will take, when it will be, and how you will deliver it?
Yes, you know, what we're proposing is that we have looked at the lack of opportunity to do on-site training, and because of COVID, and we really do not see that there is a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of being able to travel exclusively to wherever we need to go. And therefore, we have looked at the online training. And what we are proposing is to look at the basic training and look at the qualification training and then offer training which is online. But it will be virtual training, so it will still be instructor-led training. It will not be e-learning. As some people will have an understanding of e-learning, and there's a difference between online instructor-led training and e-learning. It will be instructor-led virtual online training, very similar to holding a webinar, but and we are proposing then to cover the globe, and we would have probably 2 sessions a week of about 1 hour, and we feel that. With online discussions, we feel that 1 hour of training is sufficient to absorb knowledge. We have then we propose then an additional 30 minutes for question and answers and discussions, and a test, and a little test, online test. And the online test, you will be so many questions, and you'll be given a time per question. So that we can have a judge of whether or not you're answering the questions collectively or individually, and that is our. But we will be promoting some details in very near future. But we hope to be able to offer AGL trainings online, instructor-led virtual training this year. And
thank you, Keith. We've got just some clarification from Steve on behalf of Oman Airports. he's just pointing out to us that the Omani Government Department of Transport are the organisation that helps Oman airports for the 5 new airports that have been developed in Oman, specifically Muscat, Salalah, Sohar, Al Dukum, and Ras Al Had. So thank you to them, and we acknowledge their part in this, and the key role they play in developing, the high quality and competent
I think
personnel.
it is different in Oman, because Steve is quite correct, because the Oman airports, it is part of the government owned organisation, where, in some airports they are private organisations. So there is a difference between government owned and private equity owned.
And Steve, thank you, Keith. Steve also points out the regulator involvement. The regulator has been heavily involved in the process too. So Tony, coming to you, and I know you're passionate about the evolution in the industry and the changes in requirements this brings in terms of competence and need for continuous professional development of all of us, everybody on this webinar, I would argue. We're currently seeing a lot of work talking about gate-to-gate technologies and continuous and collaborative decision making. Now, you very kindly agreed to work, to lead an initiative really with us, with our local regulator, to help recommend some development to the standards to meet this evolving, changing requirements. Where do you see this leading in the future?
Well, if you like, the output of the deliberations, discussions that we might have with our national authorities, that represent UK at ICAO and IEC, I think we would feel that the only way forward, knowing how ICAO works, having been part of the visual aids panel for so long, is you have to produce good documentation with good data and justification for any changes. And I think we are in the position in many of the technologies we're involved. I spent 2 weeks talking about PAPI, but there are other things like the full implementation of LED lighting, the use of lighting in the control function in advanced surface movements. I think very recently I've been looking at floodlighting of aprons and stands. Although I've been a panel member for a long time, it hadn't really struck me till I started looking recently how little information there is. ICAO does not have any standards for apron floodlighting. It has recommended practices, and there's not much of that. And the aerodrome design manual, it has even less. There's a whole area there that needs some good technological research and development to improve that area, I think. And then papers written. It will take time, but I think in things like PAPI, it needs the material in Annex 14, and particularly in the aerodrome design manual, needs refreshing and bringing up to date and make it more user-friendly than I think it is in the moment. ICAO says this is what we want done, but as Keith said, it doesn't tell you how to do it. But the danger of that, of course, is that people have different ideas of what the how to do it actually means. And I think if we had more competency around the place, or more agreed as to what you actually had to do to achieve these various levels, from basic through to the full range of qualifications, that would help draw all of this together. And I think we talked about various people that need to be trained. I actually think in many cases, the airfield, the aerodrome inspectors would benefit from doing this sort of course, because I think we've managerial wise, we've slipped into a mode where procedure is everything. Putting the right ticks in the boxes. Have you looked? Have you done a flight check in the last 6 months? Yes, tick. That's all right then, without really understanding what that tick means.
Like some years
Right.
ago,
Thank you, Tony. Of course.
some years ago, I had the opportunity to train the UK civil aviation regulators, and that was very, very good, because not only did hopefully they learnt, but I learnt also that the limited time that a regulator has to be able to assess the airside facilities in many ways, then they have to have quite an in-depth knowledge to be able to understand, as you say, the tick in the box, what they're actually looking for.
Yes, and I think actually recent
Right.
developments, I mean TMS with their ability to in-field, in-service monitor performance of lighting is an important step forward, because you say your inspector has a limited time. It's in a way the best way of doing that with the limited facilities isn't to go walking about on the airfield. It's to actually look at numerical data that proves that the equipment is performing to standard. And if you've got something like TMS that provides it in a credible and understandable form, then that takes the whole process forward. I believe the inspector can have a better understanding of your competency and how well you are meeting the regulations. So I think this increase now in testing and documenting the results of that testing is a big step forward and goes hand in hand with the competency developments, I think.
I totally agree. Yes.
Yes. So thank you. I mean, it brings to mind, first of all, I just want to thank Richard Larive, who's I can see is online here. Just wishes to point out that he's published a paper through IES, the Luminance Engineering Society of North America, specifically to take forward apron and floodlighting processes and methodologies. It's published by IES. It's called RP37. We'll put a link to it on our website, Richard, so anyone wishing to look at that can look at it. And he's also saying that there is a version, they're working on a version 2 at the moment. So we look forward to hearing more information about that, Richard. About our training courses, Keith, and has asked how and when, and we're currently exploring the technologies to make sure that we can give you the best possible experience, because obviously we'd rather do it, Keith would rather deliver this training in person, but we're trying to make it as interactive as possible, and we'll give you some more information after next week's webinar, week 15, which will be on installation and commissioning and how to demonstrate compliance. So that is next week's webinar, installation and commissioning and how to demonstrate compliance. Tony, I've got following on from your last comments. Of course, when the standards were developed that we're looking to address now, to modernize in some way for the passing and the passing of time and the changing circumstances we find ourselves in. Of course, you had your own airfield. You were, as a government scientist, you had an airfield in near London that you were able to carry out actual experiments to test the standards, to make the measurements. Now, in today's world, how would ICAO actually validate the evolving standards that we're asking them to develop? Well, they have Go on.
Actually, in the UK, this issue was addressed. The fact that that facility to have, if you like, an airfield as a laboratory to do tests on was no longer feasible. That activity was diluted and separated out and trickled away. After I retired, what the airports industry in this country came up with through the Airport Owners Association channel, because airports 10 years ago now were wanting to install LED lighting, which wasn't really compatible with Annex 14 and what had always been done. And even earlier, even with the PAPI, 25, 30 more years ago, how can you actually demonstrate it's operationally, it meets the operational requirement and is safe and is practicable and all those things when you can't really do R&D experimentation? And I was on the committee of the AOA. We wrote a document in conjunction with our Civil Aviation Authority of how you could do in-service trials on licensed aerodromes, and this applied to the implementation of LED lighting. Inevitably there were forms to fill in and meetings to be held to agree how it could be done. To be done so that you didn't in any way interfere with the licensing requirements of the aerodrome, but could still do a meaningful experiment that could say, here is an enhancement, here's an improvement. And often that means co-locating your new technology with the old technology, which is what we did with the PAPI. We left for the trials that took place in the London airports of Gatwick and Heathrow for 3 years. We left the VASI on one side of the runway and put the PAPI on the other side of the runway, so that we could have, so the airport was still legally compliant with Annex 14, but at the same time, the pilots had the ability to make an assessment during their approaches of the absolute performance, if you like, of PAPI, but also the relative performance compared with the VASI. So, you know, it is a bit of a specialist, and you really need someone who's used to setting up experiments. But yes, you can do it in this day and age if you go about it in the right way. And that document is traceable, still existing. And I think it's quite a good document as to how you can implement new technologies into an airport.
Yeah, Tony, it was followed actually, wasn't it, for the LED trials, for the runway LED trials, and it was the Manchester Airport Group that...
they were very involved in it.
Yeah. So that was the facility, the airport facility, which led to the approval of LEDs for runway-related lighting. And it followed that initial guidance document, under that project.
Yes, we needed that because otherwise the CAA, as a licensing authority, couldn't be content in their minds that something safe was being done.
Perhaps the Visual Aids Working Group would benefit from such a model. Right, Keith. Just to finish off then, as we're now 3:15 UK time, could you just give us a few words about what's going to be coming in week 15, installation and commissioning, and how to demonstrate compliance?
Yes, basically what we will we'll look at the context, and we'll probably, what we're going to do is concentrate really on inset lights, because there are two types of lights that we put on the airfield, those that we stick in the pavement and those that we stick above the ground. And so the criteria will be to look at the inset lights, which are the most critical in terms of, and the most difficult really in many ways, associated with not just for installation, but also for maintenance. So we'll concentrate on that area, but we'll also look at the tools and the methods of where we can get the electrical signal to the light fixtures. And also, once we have gone through that process of installation, how we actually put a commissioning document together. And that commissioning document then, of course, will make some clear advice on the electrical compliance requirements and the quality of the circuit, you know, the insulation resistance values, how that's worked out, etc. And also the photometric output, because ultimately it is an airfield light is a photometric output piece of equipment. Yes. And so how we measure to demonstrate the compliance. And then that criteria, where does that information come from? How do we apply it? And to demonstrate to the regulator that the equipment has been installed, commissioned correctly. And of course, when you install a piece of equipment, new equipment, and when you commission that new equipment, then it has to be set up correctly. But the criteria for compliance is higher than the criteria for serviceability of maintenance. I mean, for example, you know, we work out the insulation resistance values in terms of the minimum acceptable value before it becomes unserviceable, but we want to do maintenance before it becomes unserviceable, and therefore we put a very much higher criteria on the ohmic value for the quality of the circuit after commissioning. Yeah, so that's the criteria that that's the way we're going to look at it.
Yes, if you just look, if you look just very specifically, let's say a runway centerline light. There's an ISA candela diagram, and the intensities are shown there. Over the years, you'll do your maintenance, or we talked about it before, about the 50% it's unserviceable. Start maintaining at least when you get down to 70%. But you know, your initial installation should meet fully the requirements of Annex 14. In other words, your 5,000 candela centerline light should be 5,000 candelas at the time of installation.
Correct.
Correct. We'll have plenty of meat to get into next week. So very much look forward to that one, gentlemen. We'll be back at the same time, 2 o'clock next week. Thank you, everybody, for participating. We will check that all the recordings of previous webinars are on the website, and also with the Q&As, and we'll put the links to the other relevant documents, including that document from Richard. So thank you very much.
Robert, can I just remind everyone, this on my final slide today was that call, that request for international collaboration. And there is, on that final slide, is the contact address and etc. for us. We request, it is a call for international collaboration.
Okay, we look forward to hearing from you all, because we can't do this alone, as Keith says. Thank you very much. I'll see you all next week. Thank you. Good night.